The immediate aftermath of Isabella's death revealed the true extent of the damage her reign had inflicted on Spain, but also exposed the international dimensions of a catastrophe that had spread far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Joanna, who inherited the throne, was already showing signs of the mental instability that would earn her the nickname Joanna the Mad. Whether her condition was caused by genetics, the toxic environment of her upbringing, or the psychological trauma of witnessing her mother's decline, the result was the same. Spain was now ruled by a dynasty whose royal line had been permanently damaged. Ferdinand, desperate to restore Spain's reputation and prevent complete governmental collapse, issued a series of reforms known as the Cleanliness Edicts. All members of the royal court were required to bathe at least once weekly. The royal palaces were thoroughly cleaned and fumigated. Foreign diplomats were assured that the new court would meet international standards of hygiene and behavior. But the implementation of these reforms revealed just how deeply Isabella's philosophy had infected Spanish society. Many courtiers, having spent decades believing that cleanliness was sinful, experienced what can only be described as religious crises when required to bathe. Several committed suicide rather than violate what they had been taught were divine commandments. Others fled to monasteries, claiming that the new requirements proved that Satan had gained control of the Spanish government. The Spanish Inquisition, ironically, found itself in the position of having to investigate and prosecute cases of excessive purity, a charge that would have been incomprehensible in any other context. Church authorities had to develop new theological arguments to convince the Spanish people that basic hygiene was not only permissible but morally required. A letter from the papal nuncio to Pope Julius II provides insight into the complexity of this theological crisis. Most Holy Father, I write to report on the spiritual confusion that has engulfed Spain following the death of Queen Isabella. What began as one woman's misguided interpretation of Christian virtue has evolved into a form of heresy that threatens the foundations of Catholic doctrine. Throughout Spain, we encounter Christians who believe that water is inherently evil, that washing the body is a form of blasphemy, and that physical decay is evidence of spiritual advancement. These are not ignorant peasants, but educated nobles who can quote scripture in support of their positions. They have created an entire theology around the rejection of cleanliness, and they view the Church's traditional teachings about the body as temples of the Holy Spirit as corruptions introduced by worldly influences. Most troubling is the effect this has had on Spanish children. We have encountered young people who scream in terror at the sight of water, who believe that their parents' attempts to bathe them are attempts at spiritual murder. An entire generation has been raised to see basic human needs as sins, and the psychological damage may be irreversible. I fear, Your Holiness, that Spain may require a form of re-evangelization, as if it were a pagan nation that had never heard the true gospel. The corruption runs so deep that even our most basic teachings about human dignity and the proper care of God's creation have been twisted into their opposite. The economic consequences proved equally severe and far-reaching. The administrative corruption that had flourished under Isabella's reign had created massive inefficiencies that became apparent only when Ferdinand attempted to restore normal governmental functions. Tax collection had become so unreliable that the royal treasury was essentially bankrupt, despite the continued flow of gold from the Americas. Military procurement had been compromised by decades of corruption, leaving Spanish forces inadequately equipped and supplied. More critically, the systematic destruction of medical and scientific knowledge had left Spain intellectually isolated from the Renaissance developments occurring throughout the rest of Europe. While Italian cities were experiencing an explosion of artistic and scientific innovation, while German universities were producing new generations of scholars and inventors, Spain had deliberately severed its connections to the intellectual currents that were reshaping the world. The most tragic symbol of this intellectual vandalism was discovered in 1507, 3 years after Isabella's death, when workers renovating the royal library in Toledo uncovered a hidden chamber containing over 3,000 manuscripts that had been secretly preserved by a group of Spanish scholars. These texts, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, had been saved from Isabella's systematic purges by men who risked their lives to preserve learning for future generations. Among these manuscripts was a letter from Dr. Miguel de Cervantes, grandfather of the future author, to his son, written in 1495. My beloved son, I write this knowing that I may not live to see you again, for the Queen's agents grow ever more suspicious of those who maintain the old learning. I have spent my life studying the medical texts of the ancients, Greek, Roman, and Arab physicians, whose understanding of the human body far exceeded our own. All of this knowledge is now branded as heretical, and I have watched as irreplaceable texts are burned in public squares while crowds cheer the destruction of infidel corruption. I have hidden what manuscripts I could save in the chamber beneath the library floor, along with this letter and instructions for their preservation. Perhaps someday, when sanity returns to Spain, future generations will rediscover what we have lost. Until then, remember that knowledge is like a flame. It can be hidden, but it cannot be truly extinguished. Your mother and I chose to remain in Spain rather than flee to Italy or France, because we believed that someone must preserve what can be preserved. We are like gardeners tending seeds through a long winter, hoping that spring will come again someday. The international ramifications of Isabella's reign extended far beyond Spain's borders, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Renaissance Europe. The Portuguese, Spanish competitors in the race for colonial empire found themselves in the unexpected position of representing civilization against barbarism. Portuguese explorers and merchants encountering Spanish colonizers in Africa and the Americas were shocked by their condition and behavior.
Vasco da Gama's private journal, describing his encounters with Spanish expeditions on the Indian Ocean, provides a Portuguese perspective on Spain's transformation. We met a Spanish fleet near Calicut under the command of Don Francisco de Almeida. I had expected to find worthy competitors for the spice trade, but what we encountered was more like a fleet of pirates than Christian explorers. The Spanish ships reeked so badly that we could smell them from over a league away. When we met in council to discuss territorial agreements, I was forced to conduct negotiations on deck rather than in my cabin, for the stench of the Spanish delegation made indoor meetings impossible. More disturbing than their personal condition was their treatment of the native populations they encountered. Where we Portuguese have sought to establish trading relationships and convert the heathen through example and persuasion, the Spanish seem to view conquest as an excuse for unlimited barbarism. They rape, pillage, and murder with such abandon that the very name Christian becomes a curse in the mouths of those they claim to convert. I fear that Spain's internal corruption has infected their understanding of what it means to represent Christ among the nations. They have become a scandal to Christianity, and their actions threaten to undo centuries of missionary work throughout the world. The Dutch, who would eventually challenge Spanish dominance in global trade, found in Isabella's legacy the perfect justification for their rebellion against Spanish rule. Protestant pamphlets circulated throughout the Low Countries depicted Spanish rule as literally diseased, using Isabella's court as evidence that Catholic Christianity itself was corrupt.
The most famous of these propaganda works, The Diseased Crown, by Willem van Orange's court poet Jan van der Meer, became a bestseller throughout Protestant Europe. Behold the fruits of papist rule, where queens embrace corruption as virtue, where courts become cesspools of human degradation, where the very gold of the New World cannot wash away the stench of spiritual decay. When the Pope's most faithful daughter chose filth over cleanliness, disease over health, madness over reason, she revealed the true nature of the system she represented. We Dutch, who value cleanliness, industry, and rational faith, cannot submit to the rule of a dynasty that has proven itself incapable of basic human governance. The Spanish Empire may possess vast territories and endless wealth, but it is an empire of corruption, doomed to fall as surely as any structure built on rotten foundations. The shadow cast by Isabella's reign extended even into the New World, where Spanish colonization took on characteristics that reflected the moral and physical corruption of its source. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who documented Spanish atrocities against indigenous populations, traced many of these crimes directly to the example set by Isabella's court. The conquistadors who commit such horrors against the innocent natives of these lands are not aberrations or exceptions. They are the inevitable products of a system that has forgotten the most basic principles of Christian civilization. How can men who were raised to believe that caring for the body is sinful be expected to show compassion for the bodies of others? How can those who view suffering as virtue resist the temptation to inflict suffering on those they see as inferior? The Queen Isabella, who never bathed, created a generation of Spaniards who mistake cruelty for strength, corruption for purity, and destruction for conquest. The gold they send back to Spain is stained with blood, and the souls they claim to save are destroyed by the very example they set. As the years passed and Spain struggled to recover from Isabella's legacy, the true cost of her reign became increasingly apparent. The country that had once been poised to dominate the world found itself increasingly marginalized, its potential squandered by a ruler who had confused self-destruction with spiritual achievement. The Habsburg dynasty that succeeded Isabella and Ferdinand attempted to restore Spanish prestige through military conquest and political alliance, but they were building on foundations that had been fatally weakened. The administrative incompetence, diplomatic isolation, and intellectual stagnation that characterized Isabella's reign created structural problems that no amount of American gold could solve. Charles V, Isabella's grandson and heir to both the Spanish and Holy Roman Empires, spent most of his reign attempting to repair the damage his grandmother had inflicted. His private correspondence reveals the frustration of a ruler trying to govern an empire that had been systematically corrupted.
My advisors speak of the wealth of Spain as if gold alone could restore our greatness, but they fail to understand that true power requires more than treasure. We have inherited vast territories and endless riches, but we have also inherited a court culture that views competence as vanity, learning as heresy, and basic human dignity as worldly corruption. Every diplomatic mission must overcome the reputation we have earned for barbarism. Every military campaign must compensate for the administrative chaos that pervades our government. Every attempt at reform must battle against the religious fanaticism that my grandmother's reign unleashed upon our people. I sometimes wonder if it would have been better to have inherited a poor but healthy kingdom rather than this wealthy corpse that calls itself the Spanish Empire. The final irony of Isabella's legacy was revealed in 1558, when workers renovating the Alcazar of Segovia discovered the hidden chamber that had been sealed since the Moorish period. Inside, they found intricate tilework depicting scenes of bathing and cleansing, along with Arabic texts explaining the medical benefits of proper hygiene. The chamber also contained a collection of perfumes and soaps that, despite their age, still retained their sweet fragrance. Here, literally hidden beneath Isabella's feet throughout her reign, had been the wisdom she had spent her life rejecting. The Moorish architects who had built the palace had understood what the Christian queen had forgotten, that care of the body was not vanity, but stewardship of God's creation.
This discovery prompted a comprehensive search of other royal properties, revealing a systematic pattern of concealment and destruction. Isabella, in her zeal to eliminate what she saw as temptations to vanity, had ordered the removal and destruction of countless artifacts related to cleanliness and health. Bathhouses had been filled with rubble, aqueducts had been deliberately broken, and libraries containing medical texts had been burned. This cultural vandalism represented one history's greatest losses of knowledge, comparable to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Centuries of accumulated wisdom about health, medicine, and hygiene, knowledge that could have benefited countless future generations, was deliberately destroyed by a queen who mistook ignorance for virtue. Today, historians studying the rise and fall of the Spanish Empire often focus on economic factors, military defeats, and political mistakes. Few recognize the role played by Isabella's tragic misunderstanding of Christian virtue, or understand how one woman's personal delusion metastasized into a civilizational cancer that consumed an empire from within.
but in the shadow archives of history, where the full truth of human folly is preserved, Isabella's story serves as a permanent warning. Her court, which should have been a beacon of Christian civilization, became instead a monument to the human capacity for self-deception. She proved that the most dangerous enemies of any great power are not foreign armies or economic rivals, but the internal contradictions that arise when madness is mistaken for sanctity.
The queen who never bathed had indeed left her mark on history, not as the saint she imagined herself to become, but as a cautionary tale about the price of extremism. Her reign stands as proof that empires, no matter how wealthy or powerful, cannot long survive when their foundations rest upon willful ignorance and systematic corruption. In the deepest shadows of the historical record, where truth is preserved despite all attempts to bury it, Isabella's legacy endures, not in the prayers she thought she was offering to God, but in the warning she provides to future generations that the road to hell is paved not merely with good intentions, but with the arrogant certainty that suffering is superior to health, corruption preferable to cleanliness, and madness more holy than reason. The Shadow Tome closes this chapter of Spain's hidden history, but the stain Isabella left upon her empire and upon the world remains indelible, a reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies arise not from evil intentions, but from the terrible consequences that follow when virtue becomes its own form of vice, and purity transforms into the very corruption it sought to transcend. In the Grand Cathedral of Segovia, on a crisp October morning in 1469, the most peculiar wedding in European history was about to take place. The air should have been filled with the sweet scent of orange blossoms and burning incense. Instead, a most unusual odor permeated the sacred halls, the unmistakable stench of unwashed flesh and rotting fabric. Lord Henry Stafford, the English ambassador sent to witness this union between the crowns of Castile and Aragon, stood frozen in horror as the bride approached the altar. Isabella of Castile, 18 years old and radiant in her silk wedding gown, carried with her a cloud of such putrid smell that even the hardened courtiers, accustomed to medieval hygiene, covered their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs. "My God!" whispered Stafford to his aide, his voice barely audible above the cathedral bells. "What manner of princess refuses to bathe for her own wedding day?" This was no accident of circumstance, no temporary lapse in preparation. This was Isabella's deliberate choice, a manifestation of a twisted religious conviction that would transform the Spanish court into a cesspool of decay and death, and ultimately reshape the destiny of an empire. But how does a queen at the pinnacle of earthly power come to believe that cleanliness is next to sinfulness? How does divine faith become a pathway to physical corruption? The answer lies buried in the Shadow Tome of history, in the dark corners where madness masquerades as sanctity. The Spain of the 15th century was a land caught between worlds, and nowhere was this divide more apparent than in the childhood memories of Princess Isabella herself. As a young girl, she had been taken to visit the conquered territories of Andalusia,
where Moorish influence still perfumed the air with jasmine and orange blossoms. She had walked through the gardens of Seville, where crystal fountains sang their eternal songs, and witnessed the elaborate bathing rituals that the defeated Muslim nobility still practiced in their reduced circumstances. At the age of 9, Isabella had been present when her father received a delegation of Moorish nobles in Granada. She watched wide-eyed as these dignified men entered the Christian court wearing robes that seemed to shimmer with cleanliness, their beards oiled with fragrant essences, their hands soft and manicured. The contrast with the rough, unwashed Christian knights who surrounded her father's throne was striking even to a child's eyes. "Why do they smell of flowers, Papa?" she had asked King John II after the audience concluded.
Her father, a pragmatic man who understood the political necessity of tolerating his former enemies, had answered with uncomfortable honesty. "Because they believe that God judges them by how they care for the bodies He gave them, daughter. It is a heresy, of course, but a pleasant one." But it was Isabella's mother, Isabella of Portugal, who provided the counterpoint that would prove so crucial to her daughter's later development. A woman of deep but conventional piety, the elder Isabella viewed the Moorish emphasis on cleanliness with suspicion and disdain. "Do not be deceived by their perfumes and silks," she warned her daughter that evening as they knelt together in the castle chapel. "Satan often clothes himself as an angel of light. These people lost God's favor precisely because they focused on earthly vanities rather than spiritual purity. Their beautiful bodies housed corrupt souls, and that is why the Almighty delivered them into our hands." These competing influences, the sensual memory of Moorish refinement and her mother's harsh interpretation of Christian virtue, would war within young Isabella's mind for years to come. But it was during a pilgrimage to the monastery of Santa Maria de Guadalupe in 1462, when Isabella was 11 years old, that the seeds of her future obsession were truly planted. The monastery was home to Brother Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, a Franciscan friar whose reputation for extreme asceticism had spread throughout Castile. Unlike the comfortable monasteries that had grown wealthy on church donations, Guadalupe, under Cisneros's influence, had become a place where voluntary suffering was considered the highest form of worship. Isabella's first sight of Cisneros was a shock that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The friar appeared before the royal party wearing a rough hair shirt that had not been removed from his body in over a decade. His skin, visible through gaps in the coarse fabric, was covered with self-inflicted wounds that he claimed were stigmata, divine marks proving his spiritual elevation. His hair was matted with filth and blood, and his breath carried the stench of someone whose teeth had rotted away from deliberate neglect. "Behold the Princess of Castile," Cisneros proclaimed, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "She who will one day rule over earthly kingdoms. But tell me, child, what profit is there in gaining the whole world if you lose your immortal soul?" The question, delivered by this walking embodiment of self-destruction, struck Isabella like a physical blow. Here was a man who had achieved what she desperately craved, absolute certainty of his own righteousness. His very appearance
testified to his rejection of worldly concerns, and in her 11-year-old mind, this became the template for true holiness.
How does one avoid losing one's soul, Brother Cisneros? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The friar's smile revealed blackened stumps where teeth had once been, but his eyes blazed with fanatic intensity. By remembering always that this flesh is corruption, child. Every moment we spend caring for these rotting vessels, we steal from God. The saints of old understood this truth. They embraced filth as readily as princes embrace gold, for they knew that earthly cleanliness breeds spiritual pride, and spiritual pride is the first step toward damnation. The court of Castile in 1460 was a magnificent spectacle of wealth and political intrigue. Tapestries from Flanders adorned the walls of the Alcazar, while merchants from Venice and Genoa filled the royal coffers with gold from their expanding trade networks. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, the kingdom festered with the same political instability that had plagued it for generations. Princess Isabella, daughter of King John II of Castile, had grown up in this world of contradictions. Her childhood was spent in the shadow of civil war, where noble houses rose and fell like waves upon a bloody shore. Her father's reign had been marked by constant rebellion, and her half-brother Henry IV's claim to the throne was perpetually questioned by whispers of illegitimacy and incompetence. It was in this environment of uncertainty that young Isabella first encountered the teachings of the Franciscan friar Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros. A man of austere habits and uncompromising faith, Cisneros had gained reputation throughout Castile for his extreme interpretations of Christian doctrine. He preached that the body was merely a vessel for sin, and that any attention paid to its comfort or cleanliness was an affront to God. "The saints of old," Cisneros would intone from his makeshift pulpit in the royal chapel, "they wore their dirt like armor against temptation. Saint Jerome lived in the desert, his skin blackened by sun and neglect. Saint Francis embraced Lady Poverty so completely that he refused even water to touch his sacred flesh." These words fell upon Isabella's young ears like seeds upon fertile soil. Here was a princess struggling to find her place in a world where political survival often required moral compromise. In Cisneros's teachings, she found what seemed like a path to absolute righteousness, a way to prove her divine worthiness that no political rival could challenge or corrupt. The transformation began gradually. At 13, Isabella started refusing the weekly baths that were customary for nobility. Her servants, initially confused, were told that their princess was observing a period of religious penance. By 15, her aversion to water had become so pronounced that even washing her hands before meals was deemed unnecessary spiritual luxury.
Her mother, Isabella of Portugal, watched this development with growing alarm. "My daughter," she pleaded during one of their increasingly rare private conversations, "you are a princess of Castile. Your appearance reflects upon our house, upon our kingdom. What will foreign ambassadors think when they see you in such a state?" But Isabella had already found her answer in the shadows of religious extremism. "Mother," she replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of the truly convinced, What matters the opinion of mortal men when weighed against the judgment of the Almighty? I would rather smell of sanctity in God's nostrils than of roses in the courts of earthly princes. This was the original sin, not the biblical transgression of Adam and Eve, but Isabella's own prideful corruption of piety. In her desperate desire to transcend the moral ambiguity of political life, she had embraced a form of holiness that was, in truth, its own form of vanity. Her unwashed state became not humility, but the ultimate expression of spiritual arrogance. The year 1468 brought the death of her half-brother Alfonso, leaving Isabella as the primary challenger to Henry IV's designated heir, his alleged daughter Joanna. The War of the Castilian Succession was about to begin, and Isabella would need every advantage, political, military, and spiritual, to claim her crown. It was then that she made the most fateful decision of her life. Standing in the chapel of the Alcazar, surrounded by the flickering shadows of 100 votive candles, Isabella knelt before a wooden crucifix and made a vow that would echo through the centuries. Lord God, if you grant me victory over my enemies and place the crown of Castile upon my head, I swear by your holy name that water shall never again touch this body in vanity. I shall wear my mortality like a hair shirt, and my flesh shall testify to the corruption of all earthly things. The die was cast. The future Queen of Spain had just bartered her hygiene for what she believed was divine favor. But as any student of shadow history knows, the gods, whether Christian or pagan, have always been fond of granting wishes in ways their petitioners never anticipated. The wedding to Ferdinand of Aragon was arranged as a political necessity, but the personal negotiations preceding the ceremony revealed the depth of Isabella's transformation. Ferdinand, 5 years her senior, and already seasoned in the brutal politics of medieval Spain, had sent his most trusted advisor, Don Gutierre de Cárdenas, to assess his intended bride months before their first meeting.
Cárdenas's private report to Ferdinand, preserved in the archives of the Crown of Aragon, provides a disturbing preview of what was to come. My prince, I write with heavy heart regarding your intended bride. The Princess Isabella possesses all the political virtues we could desire. She is intelligent, determined, and commands the loyalty of the Castilian nobility. However, I must warn you of certain peculiarities in her personal habits that may require delicate management. The princess has embraced a form of religious devotion that manifests in deliberate neglect of her person. She has not bathed in over 3 years, claiming that water touching her skin would wash away her spiritual purity. Her chambers smell like a charnel house, and her servants have learned to approach her only when absolutely necessary. I fear that your Highness may find the marriage bed challenging. Ferdinand's response, written in his own hand, reveals the cold pragmatism that would characterize their relationship. Tell me, Cárdenas, does she still possess her wits? Can she bear children? Can she command armies? If the answer to these questions is yes, then I care nothing for her perfumes or lack thereof. I am marrying Castile,
not the woman who happens to embody it. But even Ferdinand's steely determination was tested when he first laid eyes on his bride in the Cathedral of Segovia. Years later, in his private memoirs discovered after his death, he would write, "I had prepared myself for many things about Isabella, her political ambitions, her religious fervor, even her legendary stubbornness, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment she lifted her veil during our wedding ceremony. The woman I had expected to be my queen looked more like a penitent hermit who had wandered in from the desert. Her hair hung in greasy ropes, her skin was gray and spotted with running sores, and the smell, dear God, the smell was like nothing I had experienced on any battlefield." The wedding night, according to whispered accounts from palace servants that survived in various chronicles, was a disaster of historic proportions. Ferdinand, despite his political determination, found himself physically unable to consummate the marriage in Isabella's presence. The couple would eventually produce 5 children, but only after Ferdinand insisted on separate chambers and what contemporary euphemisms called infrequent conjugal visits. A letter from Ferdinand to his confessor, written 6 months after the wedding, reveals the personal toll this arrangement took on both of them. "Father, I find myself in an impossible position. My wife is devoted, intelligent, and absolutely committed to our shared political goals. In council meetings, she demonstrates wisdom that surpasses many of my male advisors. She is, in every sense except the most intimate, everything a king could want in a queen.
Yet I confess that I have begun to dread the nights when duty requires me to visit her chambers. The act of procreation, which should be blessed by God as the means of securing our dynasty, has become a trial that tests my very faith. How can the Almighty intend for marriage to be such a torment? I find myself wondering if this is God's punishment for some unknown sin, or perhaps a test of my devotion to the crown of Spain. The wedding ceremony proceeded as planned, but those in attendance would later recall it as one of the most uncomfortable royal events in memory. The bride's odor was so pronounced that several ladies-in-waiting fainted during the 3-hour mass, officially attributed to the heat of the packed cathedral, but whispered to be caused by something far more earthly. As Isabella spoke her vows, promising to honor and obey her new husband, few in that sacred space could have imagined that they were witnessing the birth of an empire that would span continents. Fewer still could have foreseen that this empire would be ruled from a court where the very air was thick with the stench of unwashed flesh and rotting silk. The original sin was complete. Isabella had traded her cleanliness for what she believed was divine appointment. The crown of Castile awaited, but with it would come a curse that would transform the Spanish court into a charnel house of living decay.
The coronation of Isabella as Queen of Castile took place on December 13, 1474, in the Church of San Miguel in Segovia. It was a ceremony that should have marked the dawn of a golden age for Spain, but instead inaugurated an era where physical corruption became the hallmark of political power. As Isabella knelt before the Archbishop of Toledo, the crown of Castile hovering above her unwashed head, witnesses reported an almost supernatural moment.
A shaft of winter sunlight breaking through the stained glass windows illuminated not the traditional image of divine approval, but rather the cloud of insects that had begun to follow the queen wherever she went. Flies, attracted by the accumulated filth of her person, circled her head like a living, buzzing halo. "Behold your queen," proclaimed the archbishop, his voice steady despite the handkerchief pressed discreetly to his nose. "Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of Castile and Leon." The court that formed around this malodorous monarch was unlike any that had existed in European history. Isabella's conviction that cleanliness was sinful had by necessity become the unofficial law of the land. Courtiers who wished to remain in royal favor found themselves adopting increasingly filthy habits, creating a competitive hierarchy of stench that would have been comical if its consequences had not been so dire. The Marquis of Santillana, once known for his elegant dress and refined manners, appeared at court 6 months after Isabella's coronation wearing the same doublet he had worn to her wedding. When questioned by a visiting Venetian ambassador about his changed appearance, the Marquis replied with barely concealed disgust. "In Castile, we have learned that true nobility is not measured by the fineness of one's linen, but by one's indifference to earthly vanities." This philosophy of deliberate degradation spread through the Spanish court like a plague. The Duchess of Alba, previously renowned for her beauty and charm, ceased bathing entirely and began wearing the same silk gown for months at a time. The Duke of Medina Sidonia allowed his hair to grow long and matted, claiming that cutting it would be an act of prideful vanity. But it was not merely personal hygiene that suffered under Isabella's influence. The very infrastructure of cleanliness began to decay. The royal baths, installed during the reign of her predecessor, were converted into storage rooms for grain. The aqueducts that brought fresh water to the Alcázar were allowed to fall into disrepair, their channels becoming breeding grounds for disease-carrying vermin.
The irony was not lost on foreign observers. Here was a court that commanded vast wealth from the Americas, that employed the finest architects and artists of the Renaissance, yet chose to live in conditions that would have shamed a medieval monastery. The Venetian ambassador, Luigi Mocenigo, wrote in his dispatches to the Doge, "The Spanish court possesses riches beyond the dreams of Croesus, yet their palaces reek like the sewers of Constantinople. It is as if they have mistaken squalor for sanctity and made a religion of their own decay." The transformation of court life had profound consequences for Spanish politics and diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors began to avoid extended stays in Castile, conducting their business as quickly as possible before fleeing to the relatively clean courts of France or England. Marriage negotiations became increasingly difficult, as European princesses and their families were reluctant to join a court where basic hygiene was considered sinful. Ferdinand, meanwhile, found himself caught between his political ambitions and his personal revulsion. Court observers noted that the king had begun to age rapidly, his hair turning gray within months of his wedding. He developed a persistent cough that palace physicians attributed to the bad air of the royal chambers, though privately they suspected it was his body's response to constant exposure to his wife's deteriorating condition. A Venetian silk merchant,
Lorenzo Bembo, visiting the Spanish court in 1480 to negotiate trade agreements, left behind a commercial report that inadvertently captured the surreal nature of daily life in Isabella's palace. Esteemed partners, I write to inform you that our negotiations in Spain have concluded, but I must advise against future ventures in this market. The Spanish court, despite controlling immense wealth, operates under conditions that make normal commerce impossible. The royal chambers are so foul that tapestries worth fortunes hang rotting on the walls, their gold threads tarnished black by the corrupt air. I witnessed courtiers wearing silk doublets that had decomposed while still being worn, the fabric literally falling away from their bodies during formal ceremonies. Most disturbing of all, the Spanish nobility seems to compete over who can achieve the most revolting state of degradation, as if degradation were a currency in some mad economy of corruption. The most tragic example of this diplomatic isolation was the case of Princess Catherine, Isabella's youngest daughter. Negotiations for Catherine's marriage to Prince Arthur of England were nearly derailed when advance scouts reported on the conditions of the Spanish court. King Henry IX of England was forced to insist on specific contractual clauses requiring that Catherine be allowed to maintain English standards of cleanliness after her marriage, a diplomatic insult that would have consequences for generations.
Ferdinand's attempts to shield his daughter from her mother's influence proved futile. By the age of 12, Catherine had fully embraced Isabella's philosophy, refusing to bathe even for her wedding preparations. English observers at her marriage ceremony noted that the young princess appeared more like a penitent monk than a royal bride, her wedding gown stained with the accumulated filth of months of wear. But it was not only the nobility who suffered under Isabella's reign of filth. The common people of Spain, who had initially celebrated their queen's piety, gradually began to understand that they were living under a curse that reached far beyond the palace walls. The curse manifested in ways both subtle and horrific. Wells that had run clear for centuries began to grow thick with algae, as if the very water itself was rejecting a kingdom that had declared war upon cleanliness. Crops withered in fields that had once been fertile, their roots poisoned by soil contaminated with runoff from the royal palaces. Even the air itself seemed to grow heavier, thick with an oppressive humidity that carried the stench of decay from the centers of power to the farthest corners of the realm. Maria Gonzalez, a baker's wife from Segovia, left behind a diary that provides one of the few surviving accounts of how Isabella's philosophy affected ordinary Spanish lives. Written in crude but passionate Spanish, her entries chronicled the descent of an entire society into madness. Year of our Lord 1485. The Queen has decreed that the royal bread must be kneaded by hands that have never touched soap, for she says that cleanliness is the enemy of God's grace. My husband Pedro was chosen to bake for the palace, and he comes home each day weeping. The ovens themselves have become breeding grounds for vermin, their surfaces caked with years of accumulated grease and refuse.
Pedro says the very walls of the royal kitchens had become to weep a black substance that stains everything it touches. Year of our Lord 1487. My youngest son, Miguel, died yesterday of a fever that has been spreading through the town like wildfire through dry wheat. The royal physician came to examine him, but the man stank so badly that I could hardly breathe in his presence. His medical bag was crawling with insects, and the instruments he used were so tarnished with filth that they left streaks of corruption on my boy's skin. How can such a man heal anyone when he embodies sickness itself? Year of our Lord 1489. Pedro can no longer work. His hands have become so infected from the filth required in the royal kitchens that he cannot hold the bread paddle. We have no income, but he says he would rather starve than return to that place of corruption. Last night, I heard him praying that God would take our queen to heaven soon before she destroys what remains of our kingdom. I fear such prayers are sinful, but I cannot find it in my heart to disagree.
The plague outbreaks that began to ravage Spain in the 1480s were not random occurrences of medieval disease, but direct consequences of the systematic breakdown of hygiene that Isabella's court had normalized. Dr. Abraham Zacuto, a Jewish physician who served as court astronomer before the expulsion of 1492, kept detailed medical records that provide scientific context for the disasters that befell the kingdom. Ferdinand, desperate for answers that his wife's philosophy could not provide, secretly commissioned Zacuto to document the connection between the court's practices and the kingdom's declining health. Zacuto's findings, hidden for centuries in the archives of Portuguese monasteries where Jewish scholars had fled, reveal the methodical nature of Spain's self-destruction. The patterns of disease that I observe in the royal court are unlike anything described in the medical texts of Galen or Avicenna. The queen's body has become a living laboratory for pestilence. Her hair harbors colonies of parasites so numerous they have formed their own ecosystem. The servants who attend her carry these creatures throughout the palace, spreading them like seeds of corruption to every corner of the realm. Most disturbing is how this contamination spreads beyond the palace walls. The river that flows past the royal gardens now runs black with the runoff from the queen's chambers. Fish die by the thousands, their silver scales turning the color of old pewter. The very earth seems to reject what flows from this place. Crops planted near the palace grow stunted and twisted, as if the soil itself has been poisoned by proximity to such deliberate corruption. Zacuto's warnings proved prophetic. By 1490, Spanish merchants were being quarantined in ports throughout the Mediterranean, not because they carried traditional plague, but because they brought with them new forms of corruption that European physicians had never encountered. The Spanish rot, as it came to be known, became synonymous with a form of decay that seemed to consume both body and soul. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this societal degradation was how it affected Spain's children. A letter from Sister Maria Teresa, abbess of the convent of Santa Clara in Toledo, to the Pope, provides heartbreaking testimony about the fate of young people raised in this environment. Most Holy Father,
I write to inform you of conditions that threaten the very future of our kingdom. Noble families throughout Spain have begun sending their daughters to our convent, not for spiritual reasons, but because we are one of the few institutions that still maintains basic standards of cleanliness and health.
These girls arrive in conditions that break the heart. Children of 8 and 9 years old come to us having never bathed in their lives, their bodies ravaged by infections that could have been easily prevented. Worse, they have been taught that water itself is evil, and many scream in terror when we attempt to wash them. We have had to develop special prayers and rituals to convince them that cleanliness, properly understood, is indeed godly. But the psychological damage runs deeper than physical neglect. These children have grown up in an environment where basic human needs are treated as sins. They associate pain with virtue, filth with holiness, and suffering with divine favor. We fear that an entire generation of Spanish nobility is being raised to believe that corruption of the body leads to elevation of the soul. The international implications of Spain's transformation became clear through the accounts of foreign diplomats stationed at Isabella's court. Sir Thomas More, then a young lawyer serving as an aide to English ambassadors, wrote to his father about conditions that challenged his understanding of Christian civilization. "Dearest Father, you have asked me to provide detailed reports of Spanish court life for presentation to His Majesty. I find myself struggling to describe what I have witnessed without appearing to exaggerate or invent fantastical tales. The Spanish court possesses wealth that rivals that of Solomon's temple. Their treasury overflows with gold from the New World. Their libraries contain manuscripts that are the envy of scholars throughout Europe, and their territorial dominions span continents. Yet they have chosen to live like the most degraded hermits, as if prosperity itself were a sin requiring penance. I have attended royal banquets where the food was prepared by cooks whose hands had not been washed in months. I have participated in diplomatic negotiations conducted in rooms where the stench was so overwhelming that several of my colleagues vomited during crucial discussions. Most disturbing of all, I have watched Spanish nobles compete to see who can achieve the most revolting state of personal decay, as if filth were a form of currency in this bizarre economy of degradation. What troubles me most is not merely the physical conditions, but the theological implications. These people believe they are serving God through their self-imposed corruption. They quote scripture to justify practices that would shame a leper colony. I fear we are witnessing not just the decline of a great power, but the emergence of a new form of Christianity so divorced from reason and compassion that it may represent a greater threat to our faith than any heresy we have previously encountered."
The Queen herself, despite her apparent immunity to shame regarding her own condition, began to show the physical consequences of her choices. Court physicians, forbidden from suggesting that bathing might improve her health, could only watch helplessly as her skin developed a permanent gray pallor, marked by running sores that never fully healed. Her teeth, once white and straight, turned black and began to fall out, giving her speech a characteristic lisp that became imitated by sycophantic courtiers. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this decay was how it became normalized, even celebrated. Poets began composing verses in praise of the Queen's holy filth, comparing her unwashed state to the sufferings of martyred saints.
Artists depicted her in portraits that emphasized rather than conceal the physical consequences of her choices, creating a new aesthetic where corruption became beautiful. The children of the court, raised in this environment, knew no other way of life. Isabella's own offspring, Isabella, Juan, Joanna, Maria, and Catherine, grew up believing that cleanliness was indeed next to sinfulness. They competed with each other to see who could go longest without washing, turning basic hygiene into a form of spiritual contest. Prince Juan, the heir to the throne, became particularly zealous in his adoption of his mother's philosophy. By the age of 16, his refusal to bathe had become so extreme that his tutors were forced to conduct lessons from across the room. His marriage negotiations with Margaret of Austria nearly collapsed when the Austrian ambassador reported that the prince's odor was so pronounced it caused him to vomit during their first meeting. The curse was spreading beyond the immediate royal family. Spanish nobles, desperate to maintain their positions at court, began sending their children to live in the royal household as early as possible, believing that early exposure to the queen's philosophy would provide advantages in later life. These children, raised from infancy in an environment where filth was virtue, grew into adults who were physically and psychologically damaged by their upbringing. The most tragic case was that of the Count of Benevente's daughter, Maria. Raised at court from the age of 7, she became so convinced that water was evil that she developed a pathological fear of rain. During thunderstorms, she would hide in the castle's deepest cellars, screaming that God was trying to wash away her sins. She died at the age of 19 from infections that could have been easily prevented with basic hygiene, her last words reportedly being a prayer thanking God for allowing her to die pure and undefiled by earthly cleansing.
But it was not just the human cost that marked Isabella's reign of filth. The very architecture of Spanish power began to reflect the corruption at its heart. The Alcázar of Segovia, once a jewel of medieval architecture, became a monument to decay. Tapestries that had cost fortunes to import rotted on the walls. Wooden furniture, never cleaned, became infested with insects and began to crumble. The Great Hall, where once proud nobles had danced at elaborate ceremonies, became a space so foul that even the most devoted courtiers avoided it when possible. The kitchens of the royal palace were perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this decline. Cooks, forbidden from washing their hands or utensils in the name of spiritual purity, prepared meals in conditions that would have been rejected by the poorest peasant households. Food poisoning became so common among the nobility that it was considered a normal part of court life, with some courtiers developing such severe digestive issues that they were permanently unable to eat solid food. The irony reached its peak during the conquest of Granada in 1492. As Spanish forces celebrated the final expulsion of the Moors from Iberian soil, they occupied palaces where crystal-clear fountains still flowed, and elaborate bathhouses testified to a civilization that had understood the connection between cleanliness and health. Yet these conquistadors, representing what they believed to be the triumph of Christian virtue over Muslim decadence, were so filthy that the surrendering Moorish nobles reportedly expressed amazement that such unwashed barbarians
had succeeded in conquering their sophisticated society. The contrast was most striking in the person of Abu Abdallah Muhammad XII, the last Sultan of Granada, known to Christians as Boabdil. When he surrendered the keys to the Alhambra, witnesses noted that this defeated Muslim ruler appeared more regal and dignified than the Christian monarchs who had conquered him. His robes were clean and well-maintained. His beard was carefully groomed, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone who understood that earthly authority required earthly dignity. Isabella herself toured the Alhambra after its surrender, walking through chambers where intricate tilework channeled fresh water into pools designed for bathing and reflection. The palace was a testament to 8 centuries of Islamic understanding that beauty, cleanliness, and spiritual contemplation were intimately connected. Every room featured running water. Every surface was designed to be easily cleaned, and the very architecture celebrated water as the source of life and purity.
Standing in the Court of Lions, surrounded by the mathematical precision of Islamic architecture dedicated to the celebration of water's life-giving properties, the Queen of Spain represented the complete antithesis of everything the palace had been built to honor. Her presence in that space was like watching vandalism in slow motion, the corruption of beauty by willful ignorance. A secret chronicle attributed to Ibn Battuta al-Andalusi, the last court historian of Granada, records the Moorish perspective on this encounter. On this day, the 2nd of January, in the year of our Lord 1492, we witness the final triumph of barbarism over civilization. The Christian queen, who now claims dominion over our beloved Granada, stands in the Court of Lions like a plague made manifest. Where our fountains sing of purity and mathematical perfection, she brings only the stench of corruption and the madness of a faith that has forgotten its own teachings. Our Sultan, Boabdil, even in defeat, maintains the dignity that Allah demands of those who would rule over others. He bathes daily, prays with clean hands, and presents himself before both God and man as one worthy of respect. This Christian queen, despite her victory, appears before us as something less than human, a creature that has voluntarily descended into the degradation that our faith teaches awaits only the damned in the afterlife. We are told that we are being conquered by a superior civilization. But what superiority can there be in the willful embrace of filth? What victory is there in the triumph of corruption over beauty? As I write these words and prepare for my own exile, I wonder if we are witnessing not the rise of a new empire, but the birth of something far more terrible. A kingdom ruled by madness that mistakes degradation for divine favor.
"Destroy the baths," Isabella commanded her engineers, her voice echoing off walls that had witnessed centuries of learning and refinement. "These places of vanity shall not tempt our people into sin. Let them be filled with stones and converted to storage for grain." This act of cultural vandalism, carried out in the name of Christian virtue, symbolized the complete triumph of Isabella's corrupted philosophy. The fountains fell silent, the bathhouses were demolished, and one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations' understanding of hygiene and health was literally buried under rubble and ignorance.
But the destruction went beyond mere architecture. The Christian forces, following Isabella's direct orders, systematically sought out and destroyed the extensive medical libraries that had made Granada a center of learning throughout the Islamic world. Texts on anatomy, pharmacology, and hygiene, knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries and could have benefited all humanity, were burned in public squares as works of infidel corruption. Dr. Ibrahim ibn Yunus, the last chief physician of Granada, managed to smuggle some manuscripts out of the city before the systematic destruction began. His letter to colleagues in Cairo provides a medical professional's perspective on what Spain lost. My brothers in the healing arts, I write to you from exile carrying the bitter knowledge of what has been lost. The Christian conquerors have not merely taken our city, they have declared war upon knowledge itself. The hospital of Granada, which had served the sick for 300 years, has been converted into a prison. The medical school, where physicians from throughout the Mediterranean came to study, has been torn down to build a new church. Most tragically of all, they have destroyed our understanding of the connection between cleanliness and health, knowledge that could have saved countless Christian lives as well as Muslim ones. These conquerors seem to believe that ignorance is a form of virtue and that the rejection of learning demonstrates faith. They're like men who burn down libraries to prove their devotion to illiteracy. I fear that Spain, despite its new wealth and power, has embarked on a path that will lead only to suffering and decline. A civilization that rejects the basic principles of health and cleanliness cannot long endure, no matter how much gold flows into its coffers from distant lands. But the curse of the Spanish court was not finished with its work. As the 1490s progressed, the physical decay of the royal family began to accelerate. Prince John, weakened by years of deliberate neglect of his health, fell ill with what court physicians diagnosed as a fever, but which modern medical experts would likely identify as systemic infection caused by poor hygiene. He died in 1497 at the age of 19. His last weeks spent in agony as his body, finally overwhelmed by the accumulated toxins of a lifetime of filth, began to shut down. The prince's death should have served as a warning, but Isabella interpreted it as divine testing of her faith. Rather than reconsidering her philosophy, she doubled down on her commitment to uncleanliness, declaring that her son's death had been God's way of calling him home before he could be corrupted by worldly vanity.
The succession now fell to Isabella's daughter, Joanna, later known to history as Joanna the Mad. Modern historians have debated the causes of Joanna's mental instability, but few have considered the role that a lifetime of exposure to the toxic environment of the Spanish court might have played in her psychological development. Children raised in environments of physical corruption often develop corresponding mental and emotional disorders, and Joanna's later madness may have been as much a product of her mother's philosophy as of any genetic predisposition. As the 15th century drew to a close, Isabella's empire was reaching its zenith in terms of territory and wealth,
but rotting from within due to the literal and metaphorical corruption at its heart. Gold flowed from the Americas into Spanish treasuries, but the court that controlled this wealth was becoming increasingly isolated from the rest of European civilization due to its embrace of deliberate degradation. The stage was set for the final act of this shadow history, a confrontation that would test whether an empire built on the foundation of physical and spiritual corruption could long survive, and what price would ultimately be paid for a queen's tragic misunderstanding of divine will.
The year 1504 marked the beginning of the end for Isabella's reign of filth, though the queen herself remained blind to the approaching catastrophe until it was far too late. The immediate catalyst was an event that should have been a celebration: the return of Christopher Columbus from his fourth and final voyage to the New World. Columbus had been away from Spain for 2 years, exploring the coasts of Central America and adding new territories to the growing Spanish Empire. His ships, the Capitana and the Santiago de Palos, limped into the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda in November 1504, carrying not only the usual cargo of gold and exotic goods, but also a passenger who would inadvertently trigger the final crisis of Isabella's reign. Among Columbus's crew was a young Genoese merchant named Antonio Grimaldi, nephew of one of Italy's most powerful banking families. Grimaldi had joined the expedition as an investor and observer, but his true purpose was intelligence gathering for the Genoese financial networks that were increasingly concerned about Spain's growing dominance in global trade. When Grimaldi was presented at court in early December 1504, the collision between two worlds could not have been more dramatic. Here was a man who represented the height of Renaissance sophistication, well-educated, impeccably groomed, and accustomed to the refined courts of Italy, confronted with the accumulated decay of 20 years of Spanish court life under Isabella's influence. Grimaldi's private letters to his uncle, discovered centuries later in the archives of the Grimaldi Bank in Genoa, provide the most detailed contemporary account of conditions in the Spanish court during its final period of decline. Most honored uncle, I write to you from what can only be described as the anteroom of hell itself. The Spanish court, which controls riches beyond the imagination of Midas, has become a cesspit of human degradation that defies description. The queen herself, now 53 years of age, appears more corpse than living woman. Her skin, which I am told was once fair, has taken on the grayish hue of a week-old cadaver. The odor that emanates from her person is so overpowering that courtiers have learned to breathe only through their mouths when in her presence, and even then many struggle not to retch. But it is not merely the queen's personal degradation that shocks the soul. The entire court has embraced this corruption as if it were a virtue. Nobles who control vast estates appear at royal functions wearing clothes so filthy they could stand upright without their occupants. The great halls of the Alcazar, which should rival those of the Vatican in their splendor, reek like charnel houses. I have seen rats emerge from behind the throne during formal audiences, as comfortable as house cats in this environment of decay.
Most disturbing of all is how this physical corruption has infected the moral and intellectual life of the court. Decisions of state are made by individuals whose minds appear as diseased as their bodies. The queen speaks of divine revelation while picking at running sores on her arms. Her counselors, many of whom show signs of the mental deterioration that accompanies severe malnutrition and chronic infection, provide advice that ranges from merely incompetent to actively delusional. I fear, Uncle, that we are witnessing the final stages of a great empire's collapse, brought low not by foreign enemies or natural disasters, but by the willful embrace of its own degradation. Grimaldi's presence at court had an unexpected effect on Isabella, perhaps because he represented connection to the broader world beyond Spain's borders, or perhaps because his obvious revulsion reminded her of how far she had traveled from conventional standards of behavior. The Queen began to show signs of doubt about her chosen path. The crisis deepened when news arrived in February 1505 that Isabella's daughter, Catherine, now married to Prince Arthur of Wales, had been widowed after only 5 months of marriage. The young prince's death was officially attributed to sweating sickness, but privately, English court physicians had noted that he had developed a persistent cough and fever shortly after his Spanish bride's arrival, symptoms that worsened dramatically after their wedding night. When Catherine returned to Spain for her husband's funeral, the contrast between her continued adherence to her mother's philosophy and the standards expected of English royalty created a diplomatic crisis that would have far-reaching consequences. English observers noted that the young widow's appearance and odor had so shocked Prince Arthur that he had reportedly spent their brief marriage sleeping in separate quarters, claiming illness to avoid the marital bed. Henry VII of England, already suspicious of Spanish intentions, began to question whether Catherine was fit to marry his surviving son, the future Henry VIII. The marriage negotiations, crucial to the alliance between England and Spain, stalled as English diplomats delicately tried to address concerns about the Spanish princess's unusual habits. It was during this period of diplomatic tension that Isabella experienced what witnesses described as a moment of terrible clarity. Standing in the chapel of the Alcazar, where she had made her original vow 20 years earlier, the Queen caught sight of herself in a polished silver mirror that had been placed there for the upcoming Easter services. What she saw was not the saintly figure she had imagined herself to become, but a grotesque parody of humanity. Her hair, unwashed for decades, hung in greasy ropes that had become home to colonies of lice. Her face, once considered beautiful, was now a landscape of sores, blackheads, and discolored skin. Her teeth, those that remained, were black stumps that gave her breath the smell of a rotting corpse.
But it was her eyes that completed the horror of her self-recognition. Once bright with intelligence and determination, they now held the hollow look of someone who had spent so long staring into an abyss of her own creation that she could no longer distinguish between sanctity and madness. The Queen's scream, according to contemporary accounts, echoed through the entire castle. Servants found her collapsed before the mirror, clawing at her own face and crying, "What have I done? Sweet Mother of God, what have I done?" This moment of recognition might have marked the beginning of Isabella's redemption, but it came too late. The damage to her health, accumulated over 2 decades of deliberate neglect, had progressed beyond the point where any intervention could have saved her. The infections that ravaged her body had spread to her blood,
and the toxins that resulted were beginning to affect her brain, causing episodes of delirium and paranoid delusion. More critically, the damage to the Spanish Empire had also progressed beyond repair. The diplomatic isolation caused by the court's reputation had left Spain without reliable allies in Europe. The administrative corruption that had flourished in an environment where physical cleanliness was considered sinful had infected every level of government, from tax collection to military command. The conquistadors who were extending Spanish power in the Americas did so despite, not because of, the support they received from home. Many, like Cortés and Pizarro, succeeded by deliberately ignoring instructions from a court they knew to be incompetent. The wealth they sent back to Spain was largely wasted on a court too diseased to make effective use of it. Isabella's final crisis came in October 1504, when she was forced to confront the reality that her legacy would not be the saintly example she had intended to provide, but rather the destruction of everything she had claimed to hold sacred. The immediate catalyst was not a political rebellion, but something far more personal and devastating: the arrival of a detailed report on the state of her own body, commissioned secretly by Ferdinand and prepared by the last remaining physician in Spain who still practiced evidence-based medicine. Dr. Rodrigo Maldonado had served the Spanish court for over 20 years, watching in horror as his medical colleagues either fled the country or adopted Isabella's anti-scientific philosophy. As the Queen's health visibly deteriorated, Ferdinand had quietly asked Maldonado to prepare a comprehensive assessment, knowing that the political implications of Isabella's physical condition could no longer be ignored.
Maldonado's report, written in Latin to ensure privacy and discovered only in the 18th century, provides the most detailed medical description of the consequences of Isabella's decades-long neglect. To His Most Catholic Majesty, King Ferdinand of Aragon, regarding the condition of Her Majesty Queen Isabella of Castile. Sire, you have asked me to provide a frank assessment of the Queen's health, and I must tell you that what I have observed defies both medical understanding and human compassion. Her Majesty's body has become a catalogue of every disease known to affect the human form, and several that I have never encountered in 30 years of medical practice. The Queen's skin, once reported to have been fair and smooth, now resembles leather that has been left to rot in standing water. The surface is covered with running sores that never heal, each one a breeding ground for infections that spread throughout her system. Her hair, unwashed for over 2 decades, has become home to colonies of parasites so numerous that they have begun to affect her brain function through the toxins they produce. Most critically, the infections in her mouth have progressed to the point where they are affecting her ability to speak clearly, eat solid food, or even breathe without pain. The decay in her teeth has spread to her jawbones, and I fear that the corruption may have reached her brain, which would explain the increasingly erratic nature of her decisions and the religious delusions that now dominate her thoughts. I must be blunt, Your Majesty. The Queen is dying, and has been dying for years. The miracle is not that she is ill, but that she has survived this long. Her body has become so toxic that I fear she may be contagious to those around her.
I strongly recommend that you limit your personal contact with Her Majesty for the sake of your own health and that of your remaining heirs." When Ferdinand showed this report to Isabella, hoping it might shock her into seeking treatment, her reaction revealed the complete triumph of delusion over reality. Rather than horror at what she had done to herself, she expressed joy at what she saw as confirmation of her spiritual achievement. "Do you not see, my husband?" she declared, her voice slurred by the decay in her mouth. "This physician, with his worldly understanding, has proven that I have succeeded where all other monarchs have failed. I have transcended the flesh so completely that my body has become pure spirit. These diseases, he describes, are not corruptions, but purifications. Each sore is a stigmata, each infection a blessing. I am becoming like the saints of old, dissolved in divine love."
Ferdinand, looking at the creature his wife had become, felt something die within his own soul. Here was a woman he had once respected, even if he could not love her, reduced to a raving fanatic whose delusions had not only destroyed her own life, but threatened the future of Spain itself. The confrontation with the Spanish nobility came shortly after, but it was now clear to everyone involved that they were not negotiating with a rational monarch, but with someone whose mind had been as corrupted as her body. The Duke of Alba, once Isabella's most loyal supporter, led the final delegation to the Queen. His words, recorded by several witnesses, carry the weight of a man watching his country slide into chaos. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice heavy with sorrow rather than anger, "we have served you faithfully for 20 years, believing that your unique devotions were a private matter that did not affect your ability to rule. But we can no longer pretend that your condition has not become a danger to the realm itself. Our allies no longer trust us because they cannot bear to be in the same room with their supposed partner. Our enemies no longer fear us because they see that we are ruled by madness. Our own people whisper that God has cursed Spain, and they point to your condition as evidence of divine displeasure. Most critically, your heir, Princess Joanna, shows signs of the same mental instability that has consumed you. If you will not seek treatment for your own sake, consider what will become of Spain if she ascends to the throne in her current condition." Isabella's response was to launch into a rambling monologue that lasted over an hour, during which she claimed that the noble's concerns were actually demonic temptations sent to test her faith. She declared that Spain's international isolation was proof of the country's spiritual superiority, and that the suffering of her people was a necessary purification that would prepare them for the second coming of Christ. "You speak of my daughter's condition as if it were a disease," she concluded, her black teeth visible in what she intended as a smile, "but I see it as inheritance. Joanna has been blessed with the same divine madness that has elevated me above earthly concerns. Together we will rule over a kingdom of saints, purified by suffering and elevated by rejection of all worldly vanity." It was at this moment that the Duke of Alba realized they were no longer dealing with a monarch who could be reasoned with or reformed. The woman before them was beyond redemption, and Spain's survival required her removal from power by any means necessary. The end came with merciful swiftness. On November 26, 1504, Isabella collapsed during morning prayers.
Her body, finally overwhelmed by decades of accumulated toxins and infections, simply shut down. She died 3 days later, on November 29th, in the same bed where she had once been a healthy young princess with the world at her feet. Her final words, according to Father Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, the same friar whose teachings had started her on this path of destruction, were a testament to the complete triumph of delusion over reality. I go to join the saints in paradise, clean at last in the eyes of God. The funeral of Isabella of Castile was unlike any royal ceremony in European history. The body of the queen, ravaged by decades of self-imposed neglect, required extensive preparation before it could be displayed for public viewing. Even then, the coffin had to be sealed and surrounded by burning incense to mask the odor that continued to emanate from her remains. Ferdinand of Aragon, her widower, stood at the funeral service with tears streaming down his face, not tears of grief, but of relief that his ordeal was finally over. He had spent 35 years married to a woman whose descent into madness had nearly destroyed everything they had built together. The immediate aftermath of Isabella's death revealed the true extent of the damage her reign had inflicted on Spain. Joanna, who inherited the throne, was already showing signs of the mental instability that would earn her the nickname Joanna the Mad. Whether her condition was caused by genetics, the toxic environment of her upbringing, or the psychological trauma of witnessing her mother's decline, the result was the same. Spain was now ruled by a dynasty whose royal line had been permanently damaged. Ferdinand, desperate to restore Spain's reputation and prevent complete governmental collapse, issued a series of reforms known as the Cleanliness Edicts. All members of the royal court were required to bathe at least once weekly. The royal palaces were thoroughly cleaned and fumigated. Foreign diplomats were assured that the new court would meet international standards of hygiene and behavior. But the damage ran deeper than surface reforms could address. The Spanish nobility, traumatized by decades of forced degradation, struggled to readjust to normal standards of behavior. Many had developed chronic health conditions that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The children raised in Isabella's court faced particular challenges, as they had never learned basic hygiene practices and often suffered from developmental problems related to their toxic upbringing. More significantly, Spain's international reputation had been irreparably damaged. The country that had once been viewed as the leader of Christian Europe was now seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. Marriage negotiations with Spanish nobles became more difficult, as European royal houses were reluctant to risk contamination by association.
The economic consequences were equally severe. The administrative corruption that had flourished under Isabella's reign had created massive inefficiencies in tax collection, military procurement, and colonial administration. Much of the wealth flowing from the Americas was being lost to corruption or simply wasted through incompetent management. Perhaps most tragically, the scientific and medical knowledge that had been preserved in Spain's libraries, much of it inherited from the Moorish period, was actively suppressed under Isabella's influence. Texts on anatomy, medicine, and hygiene were banned as contrary to Christian doctrine. This intellectual vandalism set back Spanish scientific development by centuries, contributing to the country's eventual decline from its position as a world power.
The final irony of Isabella's legacy was revealed in 1512, 8 years after her death, when workers renovating the Alcazar discovered a hidden chamber that had been sealed since the Moorish period. Inside, they found intricate tilework depicting scenes of bathing and cleansing, along with Arabic texts explaining the medical benefits of proper hygiene. The chamber also contained a collection of perfumes and soaps that, despite their age, still retained their sweet fragrance. Here, literally hidden beneath Isabella's feet throughout her reign, had been the wisdom she had spent her life rejecting. The Moorish architects who had built the palace had understood what the Christian queen had forgotten, that care of the body was not vanity, but stewardship of God's creation.
The discovery of the hidden chamber prompted Ferdinand to order a comprehensive search of other royal properties. What they found was a systematic pattern of concealment and destruction. Isabella, in her zeal to eliminate what she saw as temptations to vanity, had ordered the removal and destruction of countless artifacts related to cleanliness and health. Bathhouses had been filled with rubble, aqueducts had been deliberately broken, and libraries containing medical texts had been burned. This cultural vandalism represented one of history's greatest losses of knowledge, comparable to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Centuries of accumulated wisdom about health, medicine, and hygiene, knowledge that could have benefited countless future generations, was deliberately destroyed by a queen who mistook ignorance for virtue. As the years passed and Spain struggled to recover from Isabella's legacy, the true cost of her reign became increasingly apparent. The country that had once been poised to dominate the world found itself increasingly marginalized, its potential squandered by a ruler who had confused self-destruction with spiritual achievement. The Spanish Empire would continue to exist for centuries after Isabella's death, but it never recovered the promise of its early years. The wealth of the Americas sustained it for a time, but without the intellectual and cultural foundations that had been destroyed during Isabella's reign, Spain gradually declined from its position as a world power.
Today, historians studying the rise and fall of the Spanish Empire often focus on economic factors, military defeats, and political mistakes. Few recognize the role played by Isabella's tragic misunderstanding of Christian virtue. Her reign serves as a powerful reminder that individual delusion, when wielded by those in positions of absolute power, can have consequences that echo through the centuries. The Shadow Tome preserves Isabella's story not as a tale of religious devotion, but as a warning about the dangers of extremism in any form. Her court, which should have been a beacon of Christian civilization, became instead a monument to the human capacity for self-deception. In the end, Isabella of Castile achieved a kind of immortality, not as the saint she imagined herself to become, but as a cautionary tale about the price of mistaking corruption for purity. Her legacy lives on in the archives of shadow history, a testament to the eternal human tendency to destroy what we claim to love most. The queen who never bathed had indeed left her mark on history, but it was a stain that no amount of water could ever wash clean.